Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Iris Fox, and I want to extend a warm welcome to the Rough Edges podcast. Rough Edges exists to provide mental health education as well as faith-based messages in order to inspire growth and foster healing. In this podcast, I will guide you through my faith and mental health journey to dispel the stigma surrounding mental illness and to create a voice for those who wish to discover more about these topics. My hope is that this podcast will not only shed light on mental health issues, but will also reveal the intersection between faith and mental illness in order to bring growth and healing in our communities. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Rough Edges. I am so excited to be back. I have missed recording, and I've also missed, just scheduling episodes, putting the content out there. I really enjoy all of the wonderful conversations that I've been having with some really amazing guests, and I am so excited for you guys to hear what's coming up this season. So I was shooting for the beginning of this year, but hey, fourth month of the year, better late than never. But it's really cool because this is the fourth season of Rough Edges, and I cannot believe I'm saying that because it's just been such a journey, and I'm so grateful to be back again with another season. And it's very fitting that we are starting again in the fourth month of the year because this is the fourth season. So it all worked out. I am so excited because this season I am going to be exploring mental health as it is portrayed in the media. And the topics that will be discussed will be looking at mental health as how it's portrayed in movies, books, TV shows, and even music. Just like different forms of media, just to see how mental health is depicted, whether it's depicted well or if it needs a little improvement. And I'm very excited about this season because I love movies. I love movies, I love TV shows, especially any movie or TV show that has like a psychological element into it. I really enjoy those types of shows. Like, you could ask my family, my friends, they know I love psychological thrillers. I love TV shows that explore mental health and just like media in general that really uplifts and gives an accurate portrayal of mental health. So I'm really excited to see what this season definitely has in store. And so this episode is just like an introductory episode, kind of going into the media's portrayal of mental health and just like the stigmatization, the glamorization, or the trivialization of just how mental health is shown in the media and why that needs to change. So I'm going to do kind of like a deep dive into the different layers of how mental health is portrayed in media and just what that looks like to the general public. So, the first area of how mental health is portrayed in the media is usually through glamorization. So, glamorizing mental health in the media is it means that in a movie or a show or a book, it's making a mental health diagnosis desirable, fascinating, or even attractive. And a lot of shows do this. One example of this is Harley Quinn, the character of Harley Quinn. And for those of you who are not a Batman nerd like me, Harley Quinn is a character based on, DC Comics, and she is really like the Joker's girlfriend in a sense, where she was a psychiatrist and she went by Harleen Quinzel at first, and then after she met the Joker and tried to treat him as a patient, well, his influence was way stronger than hers, and she fell into a downward spiral of just being undyingly devoted to the Joker. And through that, she was able to become Harley Quinn. And her perception of life was just offbeat. It was kind of off balance. And she's often labeled as crazy and eccentric and also very like quirky, and it kind of makes her more attractive, especially in the movie The Suicide Squad. Not the newest one, I'm talking about the like original The Suicide Squad with Will Smith and Margot Robbie and Viola Davis as well. And just in that movie alone, like she was depicted as just a hypersexualized, psychotic woman who would just live on the edge and not, really have any inhibitions. She was just like wild. And that type of portrayal kind of makes it seem like, oh, being psychotic is actually kind of hot. It's actually attractive. And that glamorization of somebody who has like a mental condition could be very problematic because it makes people see it as something of, a desire. Like, oh, I must, in order to have like some type of like attraction, I must be, out there. I must be wild. And that's kind of like what glamorization does. Another area of how the media portrays mental health is through trivialization. So the media also trivializes mental illness either by promoting mental health conditions as not being severe or being less severe than it actually is. And a big example of this is often done with eating disorders. So, eating disorders are often portrayed as being a fast track to losing or gaining the weight that you want, rather than being depicted as a serious condition. And I want to point out two good examples of how eating disorders like can be portrayed and can be highlighted in like the severe light of how this condition actually is. And so Jeanette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died, her memoir gives a very detailed description of what living with an eating disorder can be like. And she gives like very detailed descriptions of just her bouts with anorexia and also bulimia and how that could affect the psyche as well. And the same goes for Demi Lovato's Dancing with the Devil documentary on YouTube. She also depicts her battles with having an eating disorder in a non trivialized and very transparent way. So, those are really two good examples of how not to trivialize a mental health condition. The third way that the media can portray mental health is through stigmatization. So I'm sure you've heard of the word stigma, like a lot of times. It's a word that's, often thrown around a little bit casually. But in relation to mental illnesses, stigma is when someone is marked or discredited somehow, or reduced from being a whole person to being a stereotype, or labeled as a collection of symptoms or just a single diagnosis. And an example of that is labeling someone as psychotic or crazy. I know crazy is a bit of like a buzzword right now, because it's really demeaning in a way. Like, I know back in the day we used to describe things as crazy, like, oh, you're so crazy for thinking that, or wow, did you see that thing? It was so crazy. Like, we would just use the word crazy in kind of like a jovial sense. But nowadays, the word crazy is very much like perpetuating the stigma surrounding people who have serious mental health conditions. And it's just a terrible label that we give to people who are really struggling with these real issues. And calling someone crazy because they've had a bad experience with mental health is just very demeaning. And so, in movies or shows or books that depict people who may be mentally unstable, they are seen as excessively violent, or in the other spectrum, they're seen as highly incompetent people, and it perpetuates the stereotype of mentally unstable people lacking self control. So, in a lot of movies that depict mentally ill characters, they depict them as being overly violent. Like anything could tick them off in like a split second and cause them to be violent. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a possibility of a person with a mental health condition being violent. I mean, especially in my case, in experiencing mania, um, I was a little bit violent, but that's not to say that this is the case for everyone. So just putting everybody in that same boat and saying that they're all violent and saying that people who have a mental health condition lack self-control, they lack, like proper decision making skills. Saying that and kind of grouping everybody into one area and category is just very demeaning, and it's very derogatory as well. There was a movie study done by Very Well Mind, and it was taking movies from 1994 all the way up until 2010, and they were seeing what the patterns were in examining someone who had schizophrenia. Like they would look at the characters in the movie who were diagnosed with schizophrenia and see how they were depicted. And the results of that study were very, very enlightening because it just shows like how the media was able to just take a very real, very severe mental health condition and almost kind of just make it an overgeneralization and an oversimplification of that disorder. So the study found that most of the characters displayed positive symptoms of schizophrenia, with the delusions being featured most frequently by auditory and visual hallucinations. So the type of hallucinations that the characters would experience would be like very positive, like they would be in their safe space, they would see someone that they loved who has maybe like passed on, and it would kind of give like a vision type of environment where it's not really like a harmful hallucination. The second thing that they found was that the majority of the characters displayed violent behavior towards themselves or others. And that's kind of going to what I was saying before, where people with severe mental health conditions like schizophrenia are often depicted in the media as being dangerous or violent people, and they're not really given an opportunity to be shown otherwise. Another thing that they found was that nearly one third of violent characters engaged in homicidal behavior. So that's another thing that the media does a lot, is that they depict people who have mental health conditions as like being just very homicidal. They're like serial killers and they're just very psychopathic and sociopathic people. And that's not necessarily the case. I personally don't deal with schizophrenia, but I do have bipolar disorder, and I'm not comparing apples to oranges here, but I'm just giving like a little bit of a context where even though there are moments where I feel low or experience anger, and bipolar rage is definitely a thing, but even though I experience those emotions, that doesn't mean that I want to go out there and murder a bunch of people. That's just not the reality of it. And so the way that these characters are being depicted is just very one-sided, and just it's an overgeneralization of the problem. Another thing that they found is about one fourth of the characters committed suicide. And that is a very, very touchy subject, um, especially given the fact that a lot of people who have severe mental health conditions do, in fact, die by suicide. And it's very alarming and it's very sad, but at the same time, that is not the story for everyone. And you can't just put everybody under the same umbrella because people have different experiences. And lastly, they found that of the movies that alluded to or showed mental illness treatment, psychotropic medications were most commonly portrayed. And so this is another complex subject in terms of like the view of medication, especially in the media, because on the one hand, medication could be portrayed as the one size fits all approach to treating mental health conditions, and on the other hand, it could be seen as something to stay away from, something to avoid. So there's never really like a middle ground when it comes to medication in the media. It's always seen as like like something that's really really beneficial, and then it's seen again as something that can cause very severe side effects and very severe consequences just because someone took medication. And I will say, although I'm not a psychiatrist or a mental health professional, I will say that medication should be a choice that is informed by a professional. So if you are thinking of taking medication, please consult a psychiatrist or your primary care physician, because you need to work together with a medical professional in order to assess your need for that medication. So it can also help you to be able to make the necessary adjustments that you need in order to get the right dosage for you. So yeah, it's very interesting that movies kind of depict it as like a one size fits all instead of looking at the intricacies of how the medicine may affect different people at a given time. So, aside from media, in like the sense of like movies and books, I want to focus on social media, because social media is a rapidly growing platform, and it is something that is just kind of overtaking our society in terms of like how much we lean into it, how much people are on it, and just how much it shapes the way that we view the world. So, given social media, having a mental health condition or a mental illness is seen as trendy. There have been many posts that I've seen, especially on, Instagram and TikTok, where people are literally trying to one up each other in terms of how much they can struggle. It's like the struggle Olympics. It's like, oh, you cried twice today? Well, I cried like 10 times today. So my day is definitely worse. I need a gold medal for struggling so hard. And that just makes me think of like how much we again trivialize mental health conditions, where it's not a competition as to who can suffer the most or who could just put all their hurt and pain on display. It's just like we don't need to advertise our struggles the same way that we don't need to advertise a false depiction of what's actually going on in our lives. So I think that, competing and seeing like who could struggle the most in a sense is just very harmful to people who are actually struggling. Another way that social media depicts mental health is that mental health conditions are seen as like quirks or personality traits. Like, for example, being depressed is often seen as edgy, and being antisocial is often seen as like, oh, that person is so mysterious and aloof. Like, they must be like really insightful. And also, being anxious is considered like another form of being different or shy, you know? And social anxiety is always seen as like, oh, yeah, you have social anxiety, so do I. Like, it's almost like a badge of honor or a label of inclusivity just because you have social anxiety. And again, these types of labels and these types of depictions in social media can make it seem like having these mental health conditions is like a part of who you are as a person, and it's your identity. Like, that's who you identify as. Like, I identify as being bipolar, and not only do I identify as that, that is who I am bipolar. And I love that even though there are these depictions in social media, there are a lot of communities that are fighting against that stigma, where it's like mental health is not a trend. It is something that is very important. It is very severe, very real, and we shouldn't just make it a trend. And another thing I've seen on social media recently, especially on TikTok, is just like people crying in front of the camera. And I've just noticed that tears are trending as well. And it's just like they would have someone crying right in front of the camera. And I'm not talking about like two or three tears. I'm talking about a river of tears. Like this person is wailing on camera. And then they would have like a caption saying, "Oh, these are the thoughts inside my head," or "This is a journey into my mentally ill mind." And I was just feeling so heartbroken over this because one, I get it. There's one thing to be vulnerable, but there's another thing to just like dramatize something so personal, something that's a human experience. And it's just so sad to see that we have just overgeneralized that feeling and just made it so that it's just not very important. Mental health conditions are not a trend, they're not a personality trait, and they don't define who you are if you've been diagnosed with a mental health condition. These are things that should be talked about in a serious setting, and it shouldn't be something that gives you popularity points. Okay, I know that the first half of this podcast episode has been a little bit negative, so I'm going to switch it over to some good portrayals of mental health as how it's depicted in the media. And the movies and shows that I mentioned, I'm going to go more in depth into these later on in the season, so stay tuned for that. But the first show that I want to mention is BoJack Horseman. Now, I love BoJack Horseman. Like, I wasn't a fan when it first came out, but I revisited it in like 2022, like so just last year, and I fell in love with it, especially because it depicts addiction, depression, anxiety, mental health and relationships, how to create effective boundaries. Like it just covers so many topics concerning mental health. And even though it's an adult cartoon, it does that with a like abundance of transparency, with dignity, and it doesn't make the characters feel like they're any less than. It doesn't make the characters feel like, oh, they've changed their entire personality because they're dealing with this. It just shows like a real human experience with mental health, and I encourage you to definitely go watch this. It's on Netflix, and I am a huge proponent of this show. So please go and watch it. It's very funny and it's just a masterpiece of mental health in television. The next movie and book is Girl Interrupted. Now, I read this book in college and I was just so blown away by it because it depicts borderline personality disorder and an experience of how it is to be in like a mental health institution. And I really love this memoir, and I also love the movie's depiction of it as well, even though they dramatize a lot of different things that happened in the book. And they kind of expand upon different things in different chapters. But I really love the depiction of someone who was dealing with borderline personality disorder. And I also love the portrayal of just like getting your diagnosis for the first time, and I literally felt the way that the protagonist felt of this book when she first got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And it brought me to the moment where I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And just to see the shock and the, just trying to get over the fact that you do have this diagnosis now and how your life is going to change after that. I feel like Girl Interrupted really depicted that well and showed the value of having the information and not letting that information define you as a person. So I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the book more than the movie, but I suggest you read the book and then go watch the movie. It is phenomenal. Crazy Ex Girlfriend is the next show that portrays mental health really well. The main protagonist, Rebecca Bunch, she also deals with borderline personality disorder. And this show also focuses on the importance of just going through your mental health journey and having a wonderful support system behind you and why that's important as well. And there's also a specific episode which I'll go into more in depth later on, but it's all about the importance of taking your medicine and just knowing that the stigma behind taking medicine is not indicative of your journey. Like, you having to take medicine doesn't mean that you are behind or that you need extra help. Just because you need some support in the medicinal factory, that doesn't mean that it's all over for you or you're behind or you can't heal. Sometimes you just need that extra push. And Crazy Ex Girlfriend depicts that feeling of inadequacy when you have to take medicine or fully rely on medicine, or what it means to be dependent on medicine. Like, it really explores that as well. So I suggest you take a look at this show. And I want to preface this by saying it is a musical. So, although it's live action, it is a musical show. So, if you're into musicals, that's definitely a plus. And yeah, it really elevates the show. So, check it out. And lastly, Modern Love. That is a show on Amazon Prime. And I want to just mention a specific episode all the way in season one. So it's like in the very beginning. It's called Take Me As I Am, Whoever I Am. And that episode depicts bipolar disorder and hypomania in such a wonderful way, where it's like very realistic and it's also scarily accurate. And I really love that depiction because it doesn't villainize the protagonist. And the protagonist is played by Anne Hathaway, by the way. And she just nails the portrayal of someone who is going through bipolar disorder and learning how to deal with rapid cycling and hypomania and the ups and downs that come with having a mood disorder. And so I really adored that episode. And I will also analyze that more in depth as well. And it is just an amazing depiction of like the struggles of bipolar disorder and just the high that you feel during hypomanic states and the lows of depression as well. And it also portrays like why having a good support system is very helpful in healing from mental health. I want to close this conversation by saying why this matters. Why explore mental health in the media? Why is this important? And I want to give you 4 reasons as to why talking about mental health in the media is very important. The first reason is that helpful depictions of mental health in the media can spread awareness more quickly than any other medium of advocacy. So, we all know that media is all around us. We're surrounded by movies, books, television, and even social media. And the amount of information that is given through these mediums are is just like astounding. Like, we just constantly have access to a wealth of information through these various platforms. And so the more accurate the portrayal of mental health, the more effective the awareness will be. The second reason as to why this topic is important is because it puts a spotlight on the media that portrays mental health well. So, normally, with anything that's kind of inaccurate or things that kind of offend people, it gets a lot more attention in the media than the good portrayals of something. So it gets a lot more attention because of the dissatisfaction or the outrage from the groups that were offended by the media that portrayed them in a negative light or inaccurately. So by having these conversations and by bringing up the movies, TV shows, books, social media platforms, social media pages that do this well, it allows the spotlight to be placed on them and taken off of the inaccurate portrayals. The third reason as to why this is such an important conversation is because it creates more profound conversations and encourages vulnerability. And having discussions about the media's accurate portrayal of mental health will spark more conversations, more questions. It will raise more awareness about this topic. So, in having conversations like this, it creates more conversations and it also breeds more vulnerability, which leads into my last point of why this conversation is so important about mental health in the media. It's because it develops hope for change in the future. So, by having these conversations, it helps others to think about the potential for changing how mental health is portrayed in the media. And I enjoy having deep conversations, especially when it comes to movies and mental health, because movies, books, TV shows, any form of media has the power to shape our perception of the world. And when we have an accurate portrayal of someone who is going through something so deep, so personal, and so challenging, it can help us to really look inside the lives of our loved ones, and it helps us to really see what people are going through, and it helps them to also be vulnerable with us and to give us an opportunity to rally around them in the way that they actually need. So I definitely look forward to exploring these topics more at length throughout the rest of the season. And I hope you guys tune in for more empowering episodes on Rough Edges. Thank you for listening to Rough Edges. This podcast is available on Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and more. For more updates on the Rough Edges podcast, please follow on Instagram at rough.edges.podcast. You can also visit the official podcast website at www.roughedgespodcast.com. If you have any questions or further suggestions for how this podcast can grow, please email at rough.edges.podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful day.